This is my ranking of the best PS5 open-world RPG games I've played, based purely on my personal experience. Each game is placed from masterpiece down to trash, depending on how immersive the world feels, how strong the progression systems are, and how memorable the overall adventure is. Let's get straight into the list. Horizon Forbidden West builds on what I liked in the first game, especially with its combat, which feels deeper and more strategic this time. I had to plan fights carefully, use different weapons, and target specific machine parts instead of relying on simple attacks. The world is large and looks visually impressive, and the side quests felt meaningful enough to keep me playing for many hours. At the same time, some older issues are still here, like the open world feeling a bit static and certain mechanics breaking immersion during fights. I also didn't connect with Aloy as much in this story compared to before. Still, the gameplay stays strong and engaging throughout. I'd place this one in my excellent tier. Diablo IV delivers a very polished action RPG experience that keeps me coming back mainly because of its combat and progression systems. I really like how each class feels different, with plenty of build options that let me experiment and play in my own way. The loop of clearing dungeons, collecting loot, and improving my character stays engaging for a long time, especially with how strong the endgame content is. The world also looks great and has a dark tone that fits the series well. However, the main story feels a bit uneven and doesn't always stay interesting, and there are some technical issues that can get annoying at times. Even with those problems, the gameplay and progression stand out. This one earns a solid spot in my great tier. Ghost of Tsushima. Director's cut feels very refined, especially in how the combat works from start to finish. I like using different stances and timing my parries carefully, which makes every fight feel controlled instead of repetitive or button-heavy. The world is detailed and visually impressive, and moving across different regions feels natural and engaging throughout the journey. The story focuses on honor, sacrifice, and change, and even though it follows a familiar path, the characters help keep it interesting. There's also a lot of side content, and most of it feels meaningful rather than simple filler tasks. It may not change the open-world formula in a big way, but it handles everything with strong polish and consistency across the experience. I'd place it within my excellent tier. Forspoken feels like a very generic open-world RPG that never really gives me a strong reason to stay invested for long. The story follows a familiar setup, and I didn't find the characters or their relationships interesting enough to care about what was happening. The dialogue also gets repetitive, and the interaction between Frey and Cuff becomes tiring instead of engaging over time. The open world is large, but it feels empty and filled with repetitive tasks that don't offer much variety or reward. Combat can be flashy and sometimes fun, especially when switching between different magic types, but it doesn't have enough depth to carry the experience for long. Movement is smooth, but that alone isn't enough to fix the game's issues. This lands in my trash tier. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a massive step forward with how it expands the world and builds on everything that worked before. I really like how the open regions are designed, giving me freedom to explore while still filling them with meaningful activities and side stories that connect back to the characters. The combat system has more depth now, with new abilities and team-based mechanics that make fights more dynamic and rewarding. The story can get a bit confusing at times with its direction, especially with how it handles certain plot elements, but it still delivers many memorable moments. The scale, variety, and character focus make it stand apart. This easily goes into my masterpiece tier. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 takes a grounded and realistic approach to open-world RPGs, and I like how it focuses heavily on immersion and detailed world-building. The combat is skill-based and requires proper timing, positioning, and patience, which makes every encounter feel more engaging and less forgiving compared to typical RPG systems. The world is large and believable, with cities that feel alive, especially when interacting with characters and exploring different areas. I found the side quests surprisingly strong, with many offering unique scenarios instead of repetitive objectives, which kept me interested for a long time. The main story carries a serious tone with emotional moments that stay memorable throughout the journey. There are some technical issues and design conflicts at times, but they don't affect the experience too much. I'd place this one in my excellent tier. Cyberpunk 2077 gives me a lot of freedom in how I approach each situation, and that's what kept me engaged for a long time. I like how Night City feels dense and layered, with different districts that each have their own identity and atmosphere. The side missions are a major highlight, since many of them feel meaningful and can even change outcomes later in the story, which makes my choices feel important. Combat also offers a lot of flexibility, whether I go stealthy, use hacking tools, or take a direct approach with weapons. The main story is interesting, even if it's not very long on its own, but the characters and decisions add depth to it. There are still bugs and technical issues that can be distracting at times, but they don't take away from the experience too much. This belongs in my excellent tier. Marvel's Spider-Man 2 builds on what worked before and focuses on making the experience bigger and more action-driven. I really like how the combat remains smooth and responsive, with new abilities and enemy types adding more variety to fights without changing the core system too much. Switching between Peter and Miles also keeps things fresh, and their different powers give some nice variation during gameplay. Movement across the city is still one of the best parts, especially with the added web wings that make traversal faster and more fun. The story has strong emotional moments and handles both characters well, even if some parts feel familiar. The open world is larger, but many side activities still feel repetitive after a while. Still, the main experience stays engaging throughout. This lands in my excellent tier. Dragon's Dogma 2 brings a very unique open-world RPG experience where exploration and combat take priority over guided storytelling. I like how the world feels dangerous and unpredictable, with encounters that can quickly turn chaotic and force me to adapt on the fly. The combat system is one of the strongest parts, with different classes and mechanics that make fights feel dynamic and satisfying, especially when dealing with large monsters. I also found the sense of discovery rewarding, since the game doesn't hold my hand and encourages me to explore on my own. However, there are clear issues like inconsistent performance, awkward camera moments, and some repetitive enemy types that can become noticeable over time. Even with those problems, the gameplay systems carry the experience well and keep it engaging across long sessions. This sits in my great tier. Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora looks visually stunning, and I really like how detailed and alive the world feels while exploring different regions. Moving through the environment is smooth and fun, especially with the traversal options that let me quickly travel across large areas. However, the deeper I got into the game, the more repetitive it started to feel, especially with missions that follow similar patterns and enemy bases that don't change much. The combat is decent, but doesn't evolve enough over time, and I didn't find many reasons to switch up my approach in different situations. The story also didn't keep me fully invested, as the characters and overall narrative felt a bit generic. Even though the world is beautiful, it lacks variety in gameplay. This falls into my mediocre tier. Rise of the Ronin has a strong combat system that kept me interested, especially with how much control it gives during fights. I like how different weapons and styles change the way I approach enemies, and the difficulty makes each encounter feel rewarding once I understand the mechanics. The setting is also interesting, with its historical backdrop adding some depth to the story and characters, even if the narrative doesn't always stay memorable. There are moments where missions feel exciting, especially when playing with others, and the gameplay systems have a lot of depth to explore. However, the open world brings in too much clutter, with a large number of activities and loot that start to feel unnecessary over time. Managing gear and clearing map icons can become tiring. Best PS4 games of all time tier list after a while. This sits in my good tier. Final Fantasy XVI took some time before it fully clicked for me, but once the story started building, it became much more engaging and emotionally strong. I really like how the narrative focuses on Clive's journey, with themes around family, loss, and freedom that are explored in a serious and grounded way. The world building is detailed, especially with how different regions and political conflicts are connected through the story. Combat shifts more into action style, and while it moves away from traditional RPG systems, it still feels satisfying with its abilities and large-scale battles. The icon fights are a major highlight, even if they can feel a bit long at times. Some side quests can feel repetitive, but they still add useful context to the world. This secures a place in my excellent tier. Like a Dragon, Infinite Wealth improves a lot over its predecessor, especially with how the combat system now feels more active and flexible. I like how movement during battles adds more strategy, letting me position characters and use the environment in smarter ways. The story also kept me interested, with a mix of serious moments and humor that works well across the long campaign. Exploring Hawaii is refreshing, and the map feels lively with a wide range of activities that keep things varied. The side content is packed with unique and sometimes bizarre missions, which adds personality to the experience. Some sections can feel long, and not every activity stays interesting, but there's always something new to do. The characters and interactions carry a lot of weight throughout the journey. This finds its way into my excellent tier. Baldur's Gate 3 sets a very high standard for RPGs with how much freedom it gives in both gameplay and storytelling. I like how the world reacts to my choices, letting me solve situations in multiple ways instead of forcing a single path forward. The writing is one of the strongest parts, with characters that feel detailed and conversations that actually matter throughout the journey. Combat is turn-based but very tactical, and each encounter pushes me to think carefully rather than rely on simple patterns. Exploration also feels rewarding, since almost every area has something meaningful to discover. The game is long, but it rarely feels like filler, because most content adds value. There are some technical issues at times, but they don't take away much from the experience. This easily belongs among my masterpiece tier selections. Stellar Blade focuses heavily on combat, and that's where I had the most fun throughout the experience. I like how the fights are built around timing, parrying, and learning enemy patterns, which makes each encounter feel engaging and skill-based. The variety of enemies and bosses also helps keep things interesting, especially as new abilities and mechanics are introduced over time. Exploration is decent, with collectibles and upgrades that give me reasons to check different areas, even if the world itself isn't very deep. The story and characters didn't hold my attention much, as they feel underdeveloped and predictable in many moments. Side quests can also become repetitive, especially when they send me back to the same locations. Still, the strong combat system carries most of the experience. This settles into my great tier. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt Complete Edition is one of those games where the world itself kept pulling me back because of how detailed and alive everything feels. I like how exploration always leads to something meaningful, whether it's a well-written side quest or a monster contract with its own story behind it. The choices I make actually have consequences, and that adds weight to even smaller decisions throughout the journey. Combat is much improved compared to earlier entries, with a mix of swordplay, signs, and preparation that makes each fight feel rewarding. The main story can feel a bit stretched at times, but the characters and side content easily make up for it. There's a huge amount of content, yet it rarely feels wasted. This clearly earns its place in my masterpiece tier. Ghost of Yōtei builds on what came before and focuses more on refining the experience instead of changing everything, and I like how that keeps things consistent and polished. The combat is the strongest part, with smooth movement, responsive controls, and multiple weapons that add variety to each fight. I found myself enjoying duels and encounters because of how timing and skill play a big role. The world looks beautiful, with different regions that feel distinct and worth exploring. The story is more personal this time, and while it follows a familiar revenge path, the main character adds more personality to it. Some missions and activities can feel repetitive after a while, but the core gameplay keeps it engaging. It may not try to do something completely new, but what it does really well. This lands in my excellent tier. Assassin's Creed Shadows takes the series into feudal Japan, and I like how the setting finally feels like a natural fit for stealth and exploration. The world is visually rich, with changing seasons and weather that make traveling through different regions more interesting. Playing as Naoe and Yasuke adds variety, since one focuses on stealth while the other is built for direct combat, though I found stealth to be more useful most of the time. The combat is more demanding now, requiring better timing and awareness, which makes fights more engaging. I also like how the map feels less cluttered, encouraging me to actually explore instead of just following markers. The story has some strong moments, but can feel predictable in places. There are also balance issues between the two characters. This fits into my great tier. Demon's Souls Remake is a great example of how to modernize a classic while keeping its core identity intact. I like how the combat stays challenging and methodical, where every action matters and careless mistakes are punished quickly. The structure with separate worlds makes progression flexible, letting me switch areas when I get stuck, which keeps the experience moving. Visually, it looks stunning on PS5, with detailed environments and strong atmosphere that make each location feel distinct. The improvements in controls and quality of life changes make it much smoother to play compared to the original. Some systems, like grinding for resources and upgrade materials, can still feel frustrating at times, but they don't take away much from the experience. The boss fights are memorable, even if a few feel uneven. This finds its place in my excellent tier. Elden Ring creates a massive open world that constantly rewards curiosity, and I like how it gives me complete freedom from the very beginning. I can go anywhere, take on different challenges, or simply explore and find hidden areas without being forced into a strict path. The world design is incredible, with unexpected encounters, dungeons, and secrets that make exploration exciting every time. Combat builds on the Souls formula with more flexibility, allowing different playstyles through weapons, magic, and abilities. The difficulty is high, but I always have the option to leave, improve, and come back stronger. The story is not always easy to follow, but discovering it piece by piece adds to the experience. Even after many hours, there's always something new to uncover. This easily earns a spot in my masterpiece tier. Hogwarts Legacy captures the fantasy of exploring the wizarding world, and I really like how detailed Hogwarts and its surroundings feel. Walking through the castle, discovering secrets, and flying across the map makes exploration enjoyable for a long time. The combat system is also a strong part, with different spells that can be combined in creative ways, making fights more engaging than expected. I found the side content quite addictive, with plenty of activities that kept me busy beyond the main story. However, the story itself can feel predictable, and enemy variety becomes limited after a while. There are also some technical issues that can break immersion at times. Even with those flaws, the experience stays fun and worth spending time with. This goes into my great tier. Monster Hunter Wilds feels much smoother to play, and I really like how quickly I can jump from one hunt to the next without constant interruptions. The world looks great, especially with changing weather that makes each area feel a bit different every time I visit. Combat is still the main highlight for me, with better control during attacks and new mechanics like wounds that make fights more engaging. I enjoy learning monster patterns and picking the right moments to strike, even if the game doesn't push me too hard. The difficulty is lower than I expected, and I didn't have to think much about builds or gear. Even so, the gameplay stays fun and easy to get into for long sessions. This one goes into my excellent tier. Death Stranding 2 improves on the first game in ways that I really notice while playing, especially with smoother systems and better pacing during long deliveries. I like how moving across the world feels less frustrating with more tools and options that make each journey easier to manage. The environments are more varied, and dealing with changing weather and terrain keeps things interesting throughout. Combat is also more flexible, giving me different ways to handle encounters instead of relying on the same approach every time. The story is still very strange and sometimes hard to follow, but it kept me curious and the characters feel more engaging this time. Some early sections can feel slow before everything opens up, but once it does, the experience becomes much more rewarding and consistent. This goes into my excellent tier. Genshin Impact gives me a huge open world that I genuinely enjoy exploring, and that's easily the strongest part of the experience. I like how every area is filled with puzzles, chests, enemies, and small surprises that keep pulling me away from the main path. The combat is also fun, especially when I switch between characters and combine elemental abilities to deal more damage. However, the story can feel weak and slow, with too many repeated explanations that don't add much. Progression also becomes grindy later, especially with its gacha system pushing you towards spending or waiting. Even with those issues, I kept coming back because the world and gameplay loop are so addictive. This goes into my good tier. God of War Ragnarök delivers a strong story that I stayed invested in from start to finish, with great character moments between Kratos and Atreus that feel more mature this time. I like how the world expands with new realms and characters, making the journey feel bigger and more meaningful. Combat still feels powerful and satisfying, especially during boss fights that really test my timing and skills. However, it doesn't change enough from the previous game, so some fights start to feel repetitive over time. The biggest issue for me is the puzzles, which are too simple and often get solved by companions before I even try, which breaks immersion. Progression also feels a bit shallow since I didn't need to change gear much. Even with those problems, the story, visuals, and major moments carry the experience strongly. This goes into my excellent tier. Immortals Fenyx Rising gives me a colorful open world that I enjoy exploring, with a light and humorous take on Greek mythology that keeps things entertaining. I like how the story is told through constant narration, with funny moments between Zeus and Prometheus that make the journey more engaging. The combat is also a strong part, with different abilities and upgrades that let me experiment and play in my own style. Moving around the world feels smooth, and there's always something to do, whether it's fighting enemies or collecting upgrades. However, the puzzles become repetitive after a while, and many of them feel too simple and similar to each other. Exploration also loses some excitement because the game marks too many things for me. Even with these issues, I had a fun time throughout. This goes into my great tier. Black Myth Wukong gives me some of the most satisfying combat I've played in a long time, with fast reactions, smart timing, and a strong focus system that makes every fight feel rewarding. I really like how each boss pushes me to learn patterns and adjust my approach, which keeps battles intense without feeling unfair. The world looks incredible, with detailed environments and strong art direction that make every area memorable. I also enjoy the variety in abilities, transformations, and spells, which add more depth to combat without making it complicated. However, the story can be hard to follow if I don't already know the background, and exploration sometimes becomes frustrating due to the lack of a proper map. Technical issues like bugs and crashes also hold it back at times. Even with those problems, the gameplay carries it strongly. This lands in my excellent tier. This tier list ultimately shows that while every PS5 open-world RPG offers something unique, only a few truly stand out with exceptional world design, storytelling, and gameplay depth. In the end, the best choice comes down to your personal playstyle and what kind of adventure you're looking to experience. Thanks for watching!